So I shall pass to you there. Brilliant. Okay, everybody, I think we'll make a start because we're live streaming today, so we want to start on time. So I just want to welcome you here to another in the series of the IDS Nutrition Group and the Transform Nutrition Research Programme Consortium seminar series that we've been holding here for the last couple of terms. I'd like to welcome in particular our viewers online, as this is going to be one of the first times we've live streamed one of our nutrition events. So great welcome to people who are watching online. I think we have about 40 people already signed up and more to watch it afterwards, which is great. So I'd like to introduce something that we find here at IDS a very exciting piece of work, and it's exciting because it's rigorous, it's politically engaged, and it's certainly been making waves in the nutrition world in terms of introducing people to the idea of commitment to nutrition and how it can be measured, and how that measurement can be used by engaged groups within country to hold politicians and policymakers to account for nutrition. So without giving too much further away, I'll just introduce our speakers today. We have Dolf Tolentino and Rajit Lakshman. Dolf is a fellow here in IDS in the Vulnerability and Poverty Reduction team, and his research has been on the political economy of social regulation and the politics of public policy processes. Currently, his research is focused on various aspects of food and nutrition, including agriculture, food safety and hygiene, informal food retail, nutrition and food security. Rajit is a research officer here at the Institute of Development Studies and also a research fellow at Middlesex University. Alongside the work he's presenting today, his work has also mainly focused on conflict, poverty and development within the specific areas of migration and statelessness. And he's currently working with organisations such as the ILO and the UK's Home Office. So without further ado, just hand you over to Dolf and welcome both Dolf and Rajit here today. So thank you.
Thank you, Nick. It's my pleasure to be the first person fumbling with a microphone live here at IDS as part of the series. So bear with me for a moment. Next time I need a proper dress code, you can just pick them up on. Right, good. It's my pleasure to be here. It's actually quite interesting because I haven't presented this work before, and here at IDS, for various reasons, we were scheduled to do this last year, but then we got completely swamped by writing a report and sort of had to postpone. The findings that we're presenting today are based on last year's report. We're right now again sort of in the process of preparing sort of a repeat edition of the index. The index sort of also has some roots sort of which go back longer, and I'll give you a bit of background on that sort of first of all. This work sort of originated from a recommendation from a task force initiated by the Irish government in 2008. The Irish Hunger Task Force argued that as part of its report, which was initiated because of the global food price crisis in 2007, that addressing hunger ultimately is a matter of political priorities. At a global level, there is no independent body which audits the implementation of commitments that governments make, and neither is there an independent authority with the power and willingness to name and shame those who have not lived up to promises made. So I'm not claiming we're going to be that independent authority, but this project is an effort sort of to show and to make it more accountable and transparent what governments are doing towards addressing hunger and undernutrition. So accountability is at the heart of our effort of research. And there's a couple of basic arguments here. First of all, we know, and around the time sort of 2007, 2008, and again sort of 2011, sort of food price crises often are sort of, we know are affecting poor people disproportionately, tremendously, given the amount of sort of income they have to spend sort of on gaining access to food. But it's always labeled as a crisis when we're speaking about sort of price rises. But actually, sort of underlying that, there's a permanent crisis of over 850 million people being in hunger on a daily basis. We never sort of label that quite as a crisis. So this effort sort of brings us, sort of starts from that perspective, and it recognizes that globally we're not making quite sufficient progress in reducing those numbers of people in hunger and reducing sort of numbers of people and children who are undernourished. That's the basic starting point here. Globally, we're pretty good, or perhaps we're getting better, sort of with a global nutrition report sort of in the pipeline now. IDEA is going to produce this in coming years. There's a consultation right now going on that you can contribute to. But we know sort of globally, sort of we're reasonably good at sort of measuring sort of outcome status. We have a fair idea of what's happening in terms of the number of children wasted in countries. We have a fair idea of the number of people sort of in hunger. We actually have very little idea sort of what governments are up to in terms of addressing these problems. There is no sort of metric around there which sort of gives us an idea of this. And if you don't make that more transparent, it is much harder sort of to keep governments to account, our argument is. And this is not just saying that governments are the only sort of factor and the only actor, if you like, in addressing hunger and undernutrition. Clearly they're not. Sort of, there's a lot of efforts that need to be taking place at quite different levels within households, within communities. But we do know that governments have a rightful place in the process of reducing hunger and undernutrition. And without having evidence or strong empirical evidence on what governments do or don't do, it's very difficult for civil societies to hold their governments to account. So basically, the bottom line of this index is, by trying to measure commitment to reduce hunger and undernutrition, we hope to generate greater commitment of governments in future to keep acting on this. So we've been working sort of on this project right now since, well, its sort of predecessor was the HRCI, Hunger Reduction Commitment Index. It's still difficult for me to pronounce it after so many years. Started working on that in 2010, and that progressed into sort of the HANCI, the Hunger and Nutrition Commitment Index. From 2012, we've been working on that. We've been developing a methodology, first of all, and right now sort of this project sort of continues for another year, and we're very much in the process now of actually sort of trying to see how does evidence like this actually run on the ground. How do local partners who are engaged on advocacy, who engage with governments, actually use this evidence, and what aspects do they find useful and what do they not find useful? And we do that because there's right now sort of, those of you who are interested in this kind of things, there's a bit of a cottage industry going on around the production of indices. I can at least name 4 or 5 different indices which all try to say something about sort of food, access to nutrition. Only 2 weeks ago, sort of Oxfam launched another global food index. There's a global hunger index. There's an access to nutrition index. There's the HANCI. You name it. There's a lot going on there. So clearly, sort of, we're all sort of feeling there's something to be done. But what we do sort of uniquely is we look at actually what governments do rather than what are the outcomes on the ground. We do this through collating secondary data, and this presentation is going to be particularly about that. But I just wanted to highlight we also do primary research in 6 countries. I've sort of highlighted sort of the areas, because in these areas we know sort of that sort of hunger and undernutrition are deeply problematic and growing as well. So India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Malawi, Zambia, and Tanzania we're working in right now with local civil society groups and try to help them sort of use the kind of evidence that we are producing. We got, for those of you who are interested, a little plug for some of the materials that we produce. Sort of pick up a copy if you like. So we're producing sort of the international index, which is based on the ranking of countries. How do countries compare to one another? But there's also the scorecards which sort of show in more detail what that sort of evidence looks like, and we're also working with communities as well as with groups of experts in these 6 countries to get a better and a more layered understanding of what political commitment sort of looks like from the perspective of both the communities but also from the perspective of in-country based experts. Because right now, producing rankings all depends on secondary data, and secondary data is only sort of available on a quite limited number of indicators. Not everything that we love to know more about sort of is currently captured in data. So you're always dependent on what's available when you're doing an index. So the remainder of the presentation is going to focus on these rankings of 45 countries. And how do we do that? Sort of, first of all, let me start sort of with some of the key concepts here, and then we move on to sort of how do we actually sort of construct the index? What indicators do we use? And sort of how do we bring it together into a coherent sort of package? And only then at the end of that, sort of, if you still have the will to live, perhaps no. I bet you will be quite interested to see the findings as well. First of all, political commitment. What does political commitment look like? How do we sort of try to measure something as slippery a concept as this? People often use sort of political commitment as some sort of all-explanatory factor. Sort of, if things go well, if you achieve sort of hunger reduction, well, obviously it was down to, you know, committed government or committed action on the ground. And sort of, if things didn't go well, well, there was clearly a lack of sort of commitment. So as a concept, it's quite notorious. It's problematic, sort of. But so we dug a little bit deeper and sort of came up sort of with one way of looking at commitment, which we felt was useful, that could sort of allow us to move sort of to the next stage of sort of trying to operationalize this. And so Oliver Morrissey from Nottingham and Ian Score, he's at UEA, East Anglia right now, sort of, they say, well, you know, political commitment is a mixture of both intention and action. On the intention side, some of that might not be manifested. There might be sort of, governments might be committed, but decide not to act because for various sort of political calculations or for various other reasons, they decide not to act. But it doesn't mean they're not committed at that point of time. But action, of course, speaks fairly loud. You can see, you can make it measurable, you can see what is going on. So we focus our study, our sort of index entirely on sort of what action is happening. But remember, sort of, we're not talking about sort of outcomes here. Unlike many of the other indices, we measure combine various sort of outcome indicators, stunting, undernourishment rates, and sort of bang them together and sort of come up with a ranking. Sort of, we're looking actually at these actions, sort of what's happening on the action side. And we look at sort of two realms, both on hunger and in terms of undernutrition. We would be very interested in looking at sort of overnutrition as well, but sort of finding any decent data for 45 countries which actually say something about what governments are doing on this right now is completely impossible. The idea sort of the index is if we calculate scores on an annual basis, we can actually see what trends develop over time, and then obviously we try to link that back to what's actually happening on the ground. Sort of, does commitment matter? Is commitment a factor in producing better outcomes? But that, of course, depends on sort of empirical sort of sets of data, and nobody's been collecting data on commitment so far. So we just sort of start to do that. So it's quite difficult at this stage to say, to already sort of make very clear sort of causal linkages between commitment and outcomes, because what we know of outcomes is all based on past data, whereas commitment, we just started to measuring it now. But the idea is if we move forward, we build up this time series of data, and then we can actually sort of present a much more sort of a richer causal picture of what's happening. Does it matter or does it not matter? Under what kind of conditions, etc. Right now, we look at 45 countries. This is based on pragmatism. It's based on, first of all, an important choice of picking out sort of high burden countries. So we're looking at all countries in our index, actually countries which have serious problems in terms of hunger and undernutrition. There's also a bit of sort of a legacy of having done the HRCI, the Hunger Reduction Commitment Index before. We're a set of countries in that index, and we've carried them forward. There's also the dependence on data again. So for quite a few countries that we'd like to capture, there's simply not data available on some of the indicators that we are looking at. So again, that means it makes it impossible to compare with the others. So when we say action, sort of in what sort of realms of action do we talk about? Sort of three in particular. We look at what governments do in terms of initiating sort of policies and programs. putting in place legal frameworks and laws that can protect people, that can provide people with legal entitlements to be safe from hunger and to be well nourished. And we look at what governments do in terms of their investments. What do they spend on key areas, such as agriculture, such as health. We also try to make sure we look at a set of indicators which are highly multi-sectoral, because we know that hunger and undernutrition are related, but they're also affected by a tremendous number of factors. So we are looking we recognize that government action on this could be about doing something in terms of the health service provisioning. It could be about actually making sure that more food is being produced. It could be about enhancing the sanitary environment within which people live. There's a range of efforts possible. But we're guided very much on the one hand by a definition of food security. The standard definition is that FAO applies. We need to think about and FAO has been neatly stretching its definition over time. I think to be more able to incorporate aspects of utilization of food. So the classic food security definition is about people need to have access to food. Food needs to be physically available, and people and food systems should be able to utilize food in a way that's useful to people, conducive to people's health and nutritional status. I've already mentioned some of the limitations in terms of availability of data for countries, but there's a few others as well. Getting data for the same years for all these indicators is problematic. We depend as we depend here on international data sources from the multilateral organizations in particular, but also from a few other international data sources. They are not always updated. They are not always representing the same years. So that's something to keep in mind. So if we look at 22 indicators, some indicators might actually reflect on the situation 5 years ago, and others are about the situation only last year. But this is something this is just a constraining factor that we have to live with, unfortunately. I mean, we could use that to argue for better data, and I think there is a very good argument for that, and hopefully the Global Nutrition Report is going to make an argument and put that in place as well. But just a reminder, there's also a set of indicators that we love to have more information on, how well do these government systems actually work? I mean, we know that service provisioning might not, can be done in many different ways. It can be in a highly customer-oriented way, effectively reaching poor people or not. But who's collecting data on that? Even within countries, data is patchy and scarce, leave alone internationally speaking, allowing us to build an index on that. Just give you a moment to look at this is just the data set, or the set, well, not a data set, this is the set of indicators that we're using, reflecting on the one hand aspects of access, availability and utilization around food and nutrients. On the other hand, showing the multi-sectoral nature of hunger and undernutrition. So we look at indicators which are focusing on agriculture, others on on aspects of women's empowerment and equal rights to be economically productive, equal rights to access critical assets needed to sustain people's incomes and allowing people to be free from hunger. And looking also at very specific sets of indicators which focus on nutrition. Now, the color scheme here, little disclaimer, there's a few errors here with the color, but so glance over the errors, but think about it this way. So we're looking at indicators, some of them which are specifically focusing on hunger. So producing enough food is typically promoted just to address hunger, but it's not necessarily considering its possible impacts on nutrition. Other interventions like providing supplementation of vitamin A is very specifically focused on enhancing the nutritional status of children. So we have some indicators which are very specifically nutrition focused, others much more hunger focused. And a third is sort of in between, sort of they're hanging, sort of addressing both. And again, sort of we have indicators here which are very much about sort of putting particular policies in place. Others which are much more about sort of trying to ensure people's right to food, rights to social security, putting legal frameworks in place that can protect sort of children, etc. And the spending indicators are on agriculture, on health. We would have loved to have more data, sort of, for instance, to play around with sort of, health spending. Let's focus on health spending, which is just on primary care. Try to find that in anybody who knows, please let me know. So in a way, sort of generating an index is it's sort of quite enlightening to sort of get an idea sort of how, on the one hand, how important data is, and also on what sort of blatant sort of limitations or weaknesses there are in the international system, if you like, in terms of generating some quite basic data aspects. Okay, I'm going to pass on the microphone to Rajit. Because Rajit is going to talk us through sort of how we bring those indicators together, sort of how do we sort of bring them coherently into shape, into an index.
Hello. Yeah, I'm going to take you through some of the technical details related to HANCI. As Dolph pointed out, we have 22 indicators. 10 of them come under hunger reduction commitment aspect of HANCI, and 12 of them come under nutrition commitment of aspect of HANCI. And these indicators are then divided according to the thematic levels that we have identified here, the laws, policies, and public expenditure. You might notice that the distribution of these indicators across these thematic strands is not very even. Some have more indicators and others have less so. Well, once we have set up this structure, the next stage is to find a way to meaningfully lump these indicators together, put them together. The aggregation techniques we use have 2 layers. Firstly, what we try to do is we normalize these indicators and add them together, just add them together at the thematic level. So at the theme level, we will have scales which represent that particular theme. The next level is to lump these thematic level scales together so that we can actually assess what the index level rankings, etc. are. To do that, we are using something called border scoring. The first level of aggregation was done just additively. The second level of aggregation, which is performed at the thematic level, is across the 3 themes, is done using border scoring. It's basically border scoring entails calculation of rankings of each country according to each individual theme. We have 3 of them, and summation of the resulting ranks. Basically, what it means is it's a reverse ranking method that we use. The country ranked highest will get 45 points, basically indicating that there are 45 countries in our index. The lowest will get 1 point. And given that there are three themes for each indicator, index rather, When you sum them up, we can get a total of 135 points per each sub-index actually. Remember, we have 2 sub-indices here. For each sub-index, you can get a maximum number of border points of 135. So for HANCI, which is the combination of those two, you can get a border point of 270. Yeah, why do we need to go this way rather than just lumping them together? I mean, why do we need to use border scoring? Basically because HANCI is a theory-driven activity. Theory-driven nature of HANCI requires that performance of all teams, that is all 3 teams, are factored equally into overall commitment scores. So that can be done using the border scoring method. It also avoids plurality rule paradox, which is something technical. More details, more elaborate details are available in the handbook cited there. Yeah. Another important thing that I need to talk about is how HANCI hangs together empirically. This is important because we are trying to create an index here using 22 indicators, and those 2 indicators, if they are to reflect a concept called commitment, then they need to hang together, empirically speaking. How people do this is basically look at Cronbach's alphas. We have calculated Cronbach alphas for 45 countries, 22 indicators, a value of 0.59. This alpha, this is the regular Cronbach alpha which we calculate, is available in the literature, is basically calculated using what's called Pearson correlation matrix, which doesn't work for us because Pearson correlation matrix assumes that all the variables that are going into there is continuous variables, which is clearly not the case for HANCI. We have a lot of categorical variables, some with 2 categories, some with multiple categories. To account for that, we need to move away from Pearson correlation matrices, to look at association between different indicators that we use here. So what we do is to look at replace Pearson correlation matrix with what's called heterogeneous correlation matrix, which actually accounts for the fact that some of these variables may not be continuous variables. When we do that, we come up with what we call modified Cronbach alpha. HANCI has a value of 0.68 for modified Cronbach alpha, which is still below 0.7, which is the rule of thumb, the number that people look for in order to establish that a set of indicators do in fact empirically hang together. But we take the position that, well, it's still not, it might not be something to worry about. Primarily, there's a lot of literature which argue that the rule of thumb 0.7 value is not, you should not follow that very strictly. There should be some, people need to take into account of the realities behind data before blindly applying that rule. Secondly, as we point out here, HANCI, the 2012 version which we are presenting here, includes 4 countries which do not have which compared to the other 41 countries do not have as grave a situation with hunger and undernutrition. Serious, but still not as much as the others. So, what this means is, if the situation is a bit better in those countries, then the way these indicators interact with each other will be different, indicating. So, if you remove those countries from HANCI and calculate a modified Cronbach alpha again using heterogeneous correlation matrix, then the value goes up beyond the 0.7 mark. Yeah. Another element that we have done in order to transparently show the robustness of HANCI rankings is to do sensitivity analysis. What these do is, well, basically in constructing HANCI, we have gone in the way of, subjectively making some choices about the design of HANCI. For instance, we have identified 4 areas where that subjectivity has seeped into the index. The way you normalize data, the way you weigh them, the way you aggregate, or the levels of aggregation used, and the aggregation method used. I already spoke about border aggregation. There's also additive aggregation method. For example, take for example the first alternative that we have done here. What it does is, instead of using the normalization method used in HANCI, which is min-max normalization, which is also used by HDI, Human Development Index, instead of doing that, we've used everything else is same, but we've used standardization as the normalization method. So similarly, we have done 6 alternative HANCI versions with using different design choices, and then show the relationship between the country ranks coming out of those alternative HANCI versions and the HANCI that we are presenting here. They are very closely related. The Spearman correlation values presented at the last column kind of indicate that they are nudging towards 1, which basically says they are related. Yeah, so I think I'll stop there. Pass it.
Is that working?
No. Yeah. Yes, it's right for you.
Right, okay, good. I'll use this one. Right, so before we go to the findings, just a few health warnings. Rajas had already indicated we use indicators which are measured on different scales. So in some of the indicators we talk about coverage, sort of what percentage of the population is covered, is having access to water and sanitation, for instance. Then you're looking at indicators for policy, for instance. Does the government put in place a coordination mechanism that brings together these various sectors in an institutional manner to coordinate policy? The answer to that is a yes/no. You can't, comparing a yes/no scale with a percentage scale is difficult. So hence, what we're not able to do in the index is look at some sort of an absolute commitment benchmark. That's why we're using sort of this border scoring to actually compare countries rigorously to one another on how they perform on each of the indicators. So the commitment is relative to one another. I should also mention that regardless of what you do, or how you add them up, regardless of the design, you end up with somebody on top, somebody in the bottom, and a lot of countries in between. Even if all the countries are completely uncommitted, there's still a #1 country. Okay? That's something to keep in mind. But it doesn't mean it's meaningless to rank them. What is very clear, if you want to understand exactly how a country performs on any of the indicators, you have to drill down to the indicator level, and you have to look exactly so how does it do in terms of ensuring people have access to sanitation, because you have a very absolute value for that you can point back to. Similarly for all of the other indicators. And the last point to again say and I just I do repeat that because it is very easy for people to confuse their knowledge of what is currently happening in a country or how bad the situation is with the findings that we present in terms of the ranking or the scores that the countries have in terms of commitment. So commitment right now doesn't mean that right now the outcomes are great. So having great commitment now might actually sort of lead to improved outcomes only after a certain time gap. That's what we posit. We don't have empirical evidence to say anything about the size of that time gap, but we think there's a pretty logical argument to be made. Right. So there we go. These are sort of the findings from the first run of the HANCI from last year. And as you see, sort of the findings are split up sort of for hunger reduction commitment, nutrition commitment, and then sort of we club them together as an overall sort of index, as Raj's sort of discussion of the design of the index showed you. Bang at the top sort of the index, sort of Guatemala. And let me just bring you back to the health warning again. Okay. We know that Guatemala has a notoriously bad situation, for instance, in terms of stunting. It's got a sort of an average stunting rate of 48% of children being stunted. We also know that actually amongst different sort of social groups in Guatemala, particularly indigenous communities, these stunting rates are actually double that. They're around sort of 80%, which is absolutely mind-boggling and shocking. So clearly, so there are issues remaining, sort of. Nevertheless, our indicator set does show that Guatemala is putting in place right now a lot of good measures to be on track, we hope, but we can't prove just yet, to its improved nutrition outcomes and hunger outcomes in future. So what does Guatemala do well? High levels of access to water, to safe drinking water and sanitation, compared to the others. I repeat, compared to the others. So not compared to necessarily to the absolute benchmark. If you want to have the absolute benchmark, it's 100%. But compared to the others, actually, Guatemala is one of the better performing ones in the set of countries. It's good at promoting complementary feeding practices once the child sort of moves away from breastfeeding sort of to how we could solid foods and continuous breastfeeding at the same time. 90% of pregnant women sort of are visited by skilled health personnel at least once during delivery, meaning they have also potential access to critical sort of nutrition interventions prior to the delivery. It's a good moment of time sort of to actually sort of to try to sort of catch and sort of intervene for those women who are sort of undernourished, for whose children therefore are also sort of at risk, low birth weights, etc. We see Guatemala invest substantially in health. It's put in place sort of a zero hunger plan. The current sort of I think President, Prime Minister, I'm not quite sure, President Molina, he's put in place sort of this plan with clear targets also to be achieved within his tenure. From 2012 to 2016, he's committed to bring down sort of stunting rates by 10%. So very clearly set out sort of what sort of the ambitions are, and therefore making them much more accountable, so to actually to see whether he's able to deliver on them or not. There's data available in Guatemala. Regular sort of surveys are conducted. This is critical for policymakers. Without data knowing what is the status of the situation, how will you be able sort of to come up with the right interventions? And sort of the Guatemala sort of system for bringing together the various sort of various departments in government, agriculture, health, etc., social protection, is actually deemed to be one of the best practice example in the region. This doesn't mean that Guatemala is doing well on all the indicators, not at all. And again, it doesn't also mean that Guatemala has just already sort of achieved sort of the outcomes that we're looking for. So there are other sort of top sort of ranked countries which also have actually quite poor outcomes. Malawi sort of has very high stunting rates. Madagascar is not doing much better, number 2 and 3. So we see the outcomes are bad. right now sort of we argue that sort of commitment levels are relatively high compared to the others in the set of countries. So what does this mean? Does political commitment not matter? We argue this is not likely. And I think I've explained before that right now it's difficult to say what the impact is of commitment now in terms of future improvements. And this is something that we'll continue working on as well, I should mention that. We might also find actually there are other causal factors which drive these outcomes, and we know that of course there are, because an economic downturn, big natural disasters, droughts can have massive impacts on outcomes on the ground, nothing to do with government commitment whatsoever. So we know the political commitment, or we argue commitment is one of the factors. How big a factor it is, we don't really know, but we like to sort of try to establish that sort of over coming years. Okay, key findings, 5 minutes, 3 minutes? Okay, briefly then. You might have seen already in the rankings which are presented that some countries did actually, except for Guatemala, which was #1 on nutrition commitment, #1 on hunger commitment. Quite a few countries actually have very disparate sort of scores. So they do really well on hunger reduction, but really poorly on nutrition commitment. India, for instance, is quite bad on nutrition commitment, but reasonably all right sort of on hunger reduction commitment. This picture sort of shows you sort of just using a little color scheme, just compare the countries. Sort of the top one is hunger reduction commitment, the bottom one here is about nutrition commitment. So we see quite different patterns, and also the primary research that we are conducting in countries sort of is giving us sort of suggestions sort of that actually there might be something quite different here going on. So being committed to do something about hunger is might be quite different from being committed to do something about nutrition. We also find sort of that actually sort of low wealth should not necessarily be an impediment to be committed to do something about sort of the problem at hand. So in this table we just clubbed countries together in 4 groups, using an equal distribution of border points in each of the color groups. And you see that actually some of the, and over here you see sort of the GNI per capita that the countries have at the top end. So you see some countries actually which have really low GNIs that are sort of in a group of high commitment. But also similarly you have countries with much better GNI who are in that group. But for me, sort of the key point here is about that sort of, you actually see that sort of wealth is not sort of an impediment for good commitment. So it's not you cannot argue, let's just wait for us sort of to get richer first and then we only will act on sort of, we already see empirical examples where this is not the case, which is great. We also looked sort of at sort of what happens sort of in terms of growth sort of trends sort of, and similarly sort of decelerating growth actually in the 2000s compared to the 1990s sort of, again sort of didn't seem to make a major, seem to be an impediment for commitment. In fact, Guatemala as well as Malawi sort of showed lower growth rates in the 2000s and in the 1990s. On the other hand, conversely, sort of some countries which see tremendous growth are showing very low commitment. And this is really quite interesting, perhaps from a donor perspective. You see a country like Angola, sort of very high growth. I mean, Angola is not a very good example because its growth is driving sort of reductions on stunting as well. But there's a fair few countries in the sample which show sort of high levels of growth, low levels of commitment. So it just reaffirms that, you know, addressing hunger and nutrition is an outcome of a political process within which various actors have a role to play, including civil society and governments. So that's a bit of an abrupt end to it. I forgot about my killer line in the end. But all the data is available here on this website. I'd love to come back sometime to present you some of the primary research findings, which is able to look much more at indicators for which there is simply no data available, but that we like to know more about. So have a look here, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dolph, and thank you very much, Rajit. That was a fantastic presentation and a really nice mixture between Dolph's vision on the kind of drive and impact of HANCI and some of the rigour that's gone on behind the scenes. So I'd like to open the floor for questions. I just want to check with our technical team, can we take questions from the live stream? Not today, okay. Well, if you're on the live stream, I've got my Twitter account in front of me. If you want to tweet something and have hashtag HANCI, HANCI, then I should pick it up. So just tweet something, hashtag HANCI, HANCI, and I'll see if I pick it up and we can post some questions to Dolph and Rajat. So taking questions from the audience, maybe I'll take them in groups of 2 or 3 if you'd like to post some questions. While you're waiting to put forward your question, I'll just put forward a question of my own, actually to either of you, which is, you mentioned that a lot of this is dictated by the fact that it's a relative ranking of the countries. Could you use the same data and indicators to produce an absolute measure of commitment?
The short answer to that is no if you stick to the same indicators, because of the problem of scales. The different scales don't allow you to do that. However, absolute measures of commitment, you could argue, might be found in the indicators themselves. So go back to the indicators, look at sort of how your country or your government is performing on any of those indicators, and you know exactly sort of, well, on most of the indicators, you know exactly what the benchmark is. So again, in terms of coverage, you'd like to have sort of everybody covered, everybody having access to critical health services, all pregnant women sort of covered by antenatal services. You want all children to be covered by vitamin A supplements, all children in need for sure. So at the indicator level, you can drill down to absolute benchmarks of commitment. Even on the spending, you can do so. In Africa, in particular. So, for instance, the African Union has committed, has actually agreed through its own multilateral processes on a set of benchmarks for spending on health. There's the Abuja Declaration, which countries have signed up to, and which commits them to spending 15% of their public budgets on health. Similarly, for agriculture, the African Union Maputo Declaration of 2003 sets out that and commits countries to spend at least 10% of their budgets on agriculture. So there are benchmarks.
Great. Okay, thank you. So questions, I have one here.
Cheers, thanks. I suppose my question was really around the advocacy element of it, because I think there's a kind of implied assumption that in making this kind of data available and government commitments transparent, that you can then hold them to account in some way, and that you talked about having supporting kind of advocacy efforts by in-country organisations to do that. Are you actually seeing any kind of traction and any kind of response from government on that?
Any other questions, or should we
Hi, thank you very much. I was just curious, should I assume that this is taking into account social programs like cash transfer schemes for poor families? Because it seems like indirectly those in some countries have a huge impact on nutritional status.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm from Malawi, so I'm really glad to see that it's doing really well. But then I was just interested in to what extent does this index take into account the international donor community and the influence they have? Because I know that for Malawi, most of the success has been dependent on donor funding. And in the absence of donor funding, maybe they wouldn't be able to achieve the success that they have. So I just want to know, what is the influence, like if donor influence is being taken into consideration?
wants to tell any of those?
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks for 3 excellent questions. I'll just do them just one after the other. The question of traction, do we see any traction sort of, and what sort of responses we get from government sort of on the index? What we've been doing so far in terms of working with the in-country partners is sort of develop a process that allows them to choose exactly what parts of the evidence that we present they find useful in their own advocacy processes. We've changed that over the year. I mean, this has been happening over the last year in particular. And we've learned sort of, I mean, it's quite easy with an index like this, and you probably sort of gathered that as well, sort of to get lost in the data. There's a lot of data out there in this index. And then remember, there's different layers of primary research data as well, which we are sort of in discussing with our partners. That it's quite easy to forget, lose the wood for the trees. So we've developed a process sort of with partners to actually sort of, pick and choose from the range of evidence that we have, what they find useful, and then sort of jointly develop advocacy messages. Now, this process has been going on for a year. It's in only one country we've so far been using that sort of to then actively go to government and say, well, this is what we find, this is what we argue, give me a response. And we think that's a useful way of doing it, because actually people are much better prepared, and having 3 or 4 key messages rather than coming up with a 45-minute presentation to a group of policymakers is a lot more effective. And that's why we developed sort of these scorecards in here, which are sort of pinned up there on the wall as well. Just one A4 with key information on both sides, and then say, there you go, look at that. Our experience in Tanzania sort of doing this has been very positive. We conducted in November a workshop with 12 MPs and 2 deputy ministers, presented the findings. Prior to that, in the week before, we'd been brainstorming our key messages with our partners, and the partners presented those, of course. Those were, I mean, the responses were very, very positive. Actually, sort of several of the MPs made personal commitments to raise it in Parliament. One committed to develop a private motion. The group of MPs who's organised, in this case, sort of in a sort of informal sort of caucus, has sort of committed to engage with the election manifesto writing process, which is ongoing. So there's going to be so we are tracing sort of what, if that really is going to happen. We hope it will, but it has tremendous potential sort of for actually reaching out sort of an influence policy. Second question was about sort of do you take a kind of sort of social transfers, and sort of yes, we are. I didn't mention it. Sort of it's buried in the matrix, in the table. One key indicator we look at is sort of the coverage of social protection, sort of in terms of both reaching out sort of a wide range of vulnerable groups, as well as actual coverage within that group, sort of how many people within these groups are actually benefiting from social protection arrangements. So we are looking at that. Although I have to say, sort of, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, the impacts of social protection on nutritional outcomes is still something which needs a lot more research. In terms of hunger, we know it can have major impacts, and very positive impacts. The last question was really good. Sort of, I really like that. Sort of, so what is the influence of donors? Sort of, is this all a donor-driven exercise? And what happens if the donors step out of Malawi? Do we still see this level of commitment of our government? Where's the counterfactual? It's my sort of immediate response. How would we know? I mean, one of the things which we love to pursue, and which we have been raising, so we sort of actually, if we knew sort of how much of funding for key programs is actually coming from donor monies versus coming from the Malawian government, from its own sort of tax revenues, that would be a reasonable indicator sort of to see sort of how much commitment there actually is to co-contribute, if you like. But to be honest, it's very difficult to say that sort of from a distance. However, having said that, so we do, I mean, Malawi is one of the countries in which we're working. We do get the impression from our partners that there is a real appetite in government, and also there's very high, I mean, particularly sort of at senior level of senior political levels as well. There's a strong, a fairly strong understanding of the problem, and a strong commitment to actually act on the problem as well. How do we know? We know because we've conducted sort of in Malawi 2 years of primary research now with a group of 55 experts based in country who we have asked a fixed set of questions on commitment. So we have a pretty decent understanding sort of what aspects of commitment, sort of additional to the ones that we're reporting here, the government is doing well on, and which ones not. So I can have a further conversation about that if you like, or have a look at the report. Sort of, there's a country chapter on Malawi which does discuss that information as well.
Thank you very much, Dolph. It appears our Twitter experiment has paid off. So Katz is asking, what is the rationale for not including outcome data? How do you ensure that high levels of commitment actually translate to outcomes? Let's check, see if we've got anything else. Oh, and one more comment from Twitter, from Wondering Badger. Do you have plans to cross-reference HANCI political commitment data with data showing outcomes? Yeah. Okay, great.
Right, good question. Which makes me realize I should have presented sort of the findings, because we've already done that. So we are sort of the rationale of actually sort of, we call it sort of decoupling and recoupling sort of commitment from outcomes, because outcomes can be driven by a huge number of factors. I mentioned before an economic crisis, nothing to do with government commitment. Sort of a drought, sort of a massive sort of flooding, can have major impacts on outcomes. It doesn't say anything about commitment. But obviously, we separate out sort of aspects of commitment and indicators for commitment. But then, of course, we have to bring it back and sort of see whether commitment sort of actually sort of has a contribution to make. Right now, sort of our argument is chiefly logical and fairly reasonable as well, in the sense that yes, we know that if you undertake a certain set of interventions, it's likely to drive down to enhance outcomes. And for instance, I mean, you know, the Copenhagen consensus process, bringing together sort of a set of Nobel laureates, sort of economists, sort of they came. You know, they identified, for instance, 11 sort of nutrition interventions as being sort of highly cost-effective sort of interventions to make in terms of development. So we feel that the indicators that we identify are right. They're asking the right questions, but empirically we can't just yet sort of prove how commitment now affects outcomes in future, and we have to wait for the future to come. What we are going to do in the next year, and which we've started to do, is actually try to see whether we can work it backwards. Can we calculate commitment sort of scores for the past, and then actually sort of try to build up a data series? So rather than wait for the future to come, sort of we'll just go back to the future. No, not like that, but. Okay.
Great, thanks, I'll just do a last check of Twitter. Any more questions from the audience here? Oh, we have one, Ewan at the back.
Hi, Dolph, thank you. I just wondered if you had looked at comparing the HANCI index with any other kind of development indices. Specifically, I guess the question is commitment to reducing hunger and undernutrition simply a reflection of commitment to poverty reduction and addressing the needs and priorities of marginalized groups, or is it something really separate?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. Just a quick question about external factors like weather or shocks like drought and things like that. Would that also be taken into account in making these indicators?
Just on the last one, sort of, do you mean sort of, do we actually capture responses of governments to these external factors, Are you talking about sort of the impact of external factors on outcomes?
For instance, food price spikes in 2008 or
Yeah.
droughts in a couple of countries may have different impacts on their commitment or their responses, I guess.
Very much so, so you said, for instance, sort of the responses that governments have shown to the food price rises, sort of food price crises, sort of have been quite different in different countries. That's very much the case. We have tried to look at sort of how governments sort of to look at an indicator that can measure how these 45 countries are actually sort of acting on something like that, and we sadly had to abandon that quest. I think it's could be a very good indicator to see how governments deal with buffering sort of extreme sort of price volatility, but we are simply not able to do that. So a call to all the data makers to provide us with something. Ewan, yes. Very good question. And I suppose that the real question is sort of, is commitment to development something different from being committed to address hunger and undernutrition? Sort of, we haven't made sort of that active comparison as yet, but it's been sort of in the back of our minds, and I think we should pick it up again. It's a reminder sort of to see actually whether sort of you know, our rankings are sort of something similar to, for instance, what the CGD does, sort of the Center for Global Development. They have a sort of commitment to development index. I'd like to follow up on that and we'll have to see sort of. But my immediate sense is sort of most of the indices that are out there are not about commitment. Only the CGG, sort of the commitment to development index, is actually trying to do that. And if I recall well, they focus particularly on donor countries. We also have a donor index, which I haven't told you about, but so we should compare those two, perhaps more so. But this is the only index which looks actually at inputs, at what governments are undertaking. None of the others are sort of cleanly looking at that. They might look at some inputs and combine them with outcomes. We think that's methodologically very messy if you want to say something about commitment. Again, because the outcomes are sort of affected by a lot of factors, not just by government commitment, but many other things. So you can't just club them all together. And yeah.
Great. Well,
Something you want to add,
Rajat, would you like to? I'll just say thanks once again to Dolph and to Rajat, to everyone here today, and to everyone on the live stream as well, particularly to Wonder and Badger and Kat for posing those questions. So thank you very much. Bye.